A brief introduction to the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. This upcoming July, August, and September, Logos Life community will meditate together on the words of God in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. This video will give you a brief introduction to those books. I hope that this video will help you better know the historical background and the literary features of these biblical books. In order to deal with the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, I first need to speak of the fall of Judah and the return of some of the Babylonian exiles to Judah. This is the historical background of Ezra and Nehemiah. In 586 BC, Judah fell to Babylon, and then 47 years later, in 539 BC, Babylon fell to the Persian Empire under the leadership of Cyrus the Great. After conquering Babylon, Cyrus the Great issued a proclamation allowing Judeans who were deported to Babylon to return to their homeland, and authorizing and encouraging them to rebuild their temple, which was previously destroyed by the Babylonians. The books of Ezra and Nehemiah concern the spiritual and social changes that took place among the Jews who had come back to Judah from Babylon. Ezra and Nehemiah are considered one book, just like 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings in Jewish tradition. Ezra and Nehemiah record the events that happened from the time when Cyrus issued the Edict of Restoration in 539 BC to the time when Nehemiah returned to Jerusalem from the Persian palace and once again brought religious reforms to the Jewish community. Return, rebuilding, and reform are the main themes of Ezra and Nehemiah. I suggest that you remember 4 historical events that are closely related to each other in order to understand well the meanings of each passage of Ezra and Nehemiah. The first event is that Cyrus the Great issued the Edict of Restoration. Due to Cyrus's policy of returning ethnic populations to their homelands and his religious tolerance throughout his empire, the Jews could come back to Judah and begin to rebuild the temple. Cyrus issued the important proclamation in 539 BC. The second event is the delay of the rebuilding of the temple. The Jews began rebuilding the temple with great expectations, but they faced various problems, and the rebuilding was delayed for 16 years. Because of it, the Jews were very disappointed and confused. While the Jews were neglecting the work on God's temple, the prophets Haggai and Zechariah ministered to them. In 520 BC, Haggai and Zechariah consoled the people and urged them to resume the work of rebuilding the temple. Finally, in 516 BC, the Jews completed the reconstruction of the temple. The books of Ezra and Nehemiah deal with the events that occurred after the completion of the temple reconstruction. Though the Jews completed building the new temple, they were not stable spiritually or socially. In these circumstances, Ezra and Nehemiah dedicated their lives to the spiritual and social restoration of the Jewish community. The book of Ezra has 10 chapters and can be divided into 2 main sections. This is the literary structure of the book of Ezra. In the first section of the book, which is chapters 1 through 6, Ezra does not appear. The first section summarizes what took place among the Jews who had returned to Judah from Babylon before Ezra brought reforms to them. It describes 4 major events. 1, that Cyrus the Great allowed the Judean exiles to return to their homeland. 2, that the foundation for the new temple was laid. 3, that the work of rebuilding the temple was interrupted. And 4, that the Jews finally finished the task of rebuilding. The second major section of the book of Ezra, which is chapters 7 through 10, deals with the events that happened 58 years after the completion of the new temple. In 458 BC, Ezra, a Jewish scribe and priest, returned to Jerusalem from Babylon with other priests and temple people. After he came back, he discovered various religious problems in the Jewish community in Jerusalem. The biggest problem was religious intermarriage. Then Ezra, as a representative of the Jewish people, fell on his knees and prayed a prayer of repentance for the people who were gathered around him. Ezra's prayer led the people through the confession of their sins and made them determined to obey God. This is the literary structure of the book of Nehemiah. It has 13 chapters. The first half of the book, which is chapters 1 through 7, concerns the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem. 13 years after Ezra came back to Judah, Nehemiah, a cupbearer to the Persian king, heard that the walls of Jerusalem were broken down, that Jerusalem remained in ruins, and that the people in the city were in great affliction and reproach. Then Nehemiah returned to Jerusalem with some Jews and began to rebuild the walls. In spite of opposition from their enemies, Nehemiah and the people following him, with thorough preparations and earnest prayers, completed the walls of Jerusalem in 52 days. The second half of the book, which is chapters 8 through 13, records the events that occurred in the Jewish community after the walls were completed and the Jews had regained their security. It speaks of a great spiritual awakening among the Jews that took place under the ministries of Ezra and Nehemiah, the ceremony of dedication for the walls of Jerusalem, and the second religious reformation accomplished by Nehemiah many years after the completion of the walls. Ezra and Nehemiah devoted their lives to the spiritual revival and social reformation of their nation when it was going through difficult times. I pray that meditating on the stories about the national leaders whom God used for the restoration of God's people, you will experience God's restoration in your life and listen to His messages to you today.